Here we can see the directedness of the Mandelbrot set. I recommend this link, which I also will put into the connection. I think it's very clear here that there is a direction to all these systems, and I think it's understandable. This is the only thing that is complex enough to read anything off. Otherwise there can't be any read off at all. Welcome to 1006, and today we will discuss directedness. And I will use this book as a start. It's Your Guide to the Alexander Technique by John Gray. And it's a very illustrative guide how to attain direction. Some of this imagery is rather, if you see here to this one, that there is a direction, and different direction go in different way, all add up to only one direction, and that is all system works this way. So I mentioned the chaotic system as we have here. They have a directedness. You can see an organization here. They go somewhere, they understand something. There is a system, there is a learning. This could be compared to the chaos we discussed earlier within the educational system, where there is no order, there is no purpose, there is no why, there is no directedness, and there is no awareness or understanding. We are today hurting our bodies. It looks this way. We are collapsing and thereby taking away everything that is precious in the life. This is something the brother of Frederick Matthias Alexander, A.R. Alexander, called godlessness. There is no possibility of feeling a God once you are collapsed. There is no higher purpose. Everything is this dread of having no energy, no direction, and even the very fact that your consciousness is not continuous makes it impossible to understand the soul. So you're in no position to believe. And actually it would be horrible to the whole idea of religion if people could have continued to believe. Belief was gone already 1920 when A.R. wrote these things. It's a thing of the past. But our bodies are chaotic system. That means direction cannot disappear. We can only constantly try to get rid of it. And when we purposely get rid of it, we rid ourselves of everything. Understanding, cognition, perception, but also order, directedness. And it's obviously very clearly impossible to see sort of a directedness in our lives. Meaning disappears. A.R. was working heftily. He was a very sensitive and soulful person. But all those 60 years he worked, maybe with something in the vicinity of 20 to 25,000 people, he never met one singular person with spiritual inclination before the therapy. And that's important to understand. If we start out with this posture, our belief system will be on a lower chaotic level, and we will have no understanding of higher purposes in life. And if we make this our starting point, we won't gain anything. So it's very important to understand the starting point we have. Do not take that understanding as the final understanding. Think instead that you can have an understanding that you presently don't have. Another way of explaining that, your present perspective is very, very limited. And if you make that your world, you make it ontic, so to speak, and say, I know this of the world, I have this of the world, and I have this knowledge of the world, that would be a stopping point. And AR constantly call that the end point. That's with point of no return. Then you are deep down in the cave and you won't get out because your ownership of knowledge makes it impossible to go any further. That can also be sort of described in the way of the ego. The ego becomes megalomaniac, and it says, I know all these things, I have this knowledge, I've gained this knowledge. That is absolutely impossible. If you're not an organized chaotic system, you cannot gain knowledge, and therefore you don't have knowledge. And the very idea that AR is pointing to, that you have knowledge, that's the destructive idea, because you cannot have knowledge until you go into learning, you go into discipleship. For me to understand that, it's very good to see the disciples of, for instance, Titian. He used to have 4 or 5 constantly at his side. They learned. There was a learning process. And if you haven't gone through this, you have no knowledge. And if you assume you can get knowledge from the primary school or the normal educational system, you'd be completely wrong. There is no knowledge to be had there, because it's not chaotic. The world is chaotic. It's not representational. Representational there is, it's more like a figment of your own imagination. And if you are blinded by that, a little bit like Ludwig Wittgenstein described, we are hypnotized by a picture. And if you remain in that hypnotism, if your body structure is this, obviously can be no knowledge whatsoever, no knowledge acquired, no progress when it comes to thinking, and you literally don't know anything. And if you assume knowledge and you say, I want to interpret new things in accordance to that knowledge, you will be in the same position as Sabine Hossenfelder, who says that we're not far from a theory of everything. That is an incredibly narrow perspective of what knowledge is. And I think it cannot be any more obvious in these rather fantastic photos. Do you really think these people could have any knowledge whatsoever? They are physically destabilized. They don't exist in the world anymore. This is death when it comes to thinking. And since we know the first thing to get affected when the body collapses is not the body, that's the second thing. What it's disappearing directly is the intellectual capacity. And that takes somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 20 milliseconds. Once the connection in your neck is severed, is cut, there is no more intellectual activity. That is purely automation. This is the N2 neurons going into action. And they can only repeat and rename. And that's a completely different process from learning. We have no experience of learning in modern times. It's gone. And this is something McGilchrist showed so clearly. The IQ drop has been 15 points. It is just beyond belief. That is very clearly pointing to all what education is doing is taking away intelligence, taking away understanding, taking away progress, and making it much, much harder to make predictions. And as we explained earlier with Henri Bergson and Edmund Husserl, people simply don't do pretension anymore. It doesn't exist. So what we're going to learn is something completely new, something that defies our previous understanding. And this is something that John Gray tries to explain is novel. It is completely new. And that is the harmonious way of being. There is a very elegant picture here. Here, if you look at this wonderful relationship, if you put your finger on there.
No, it's clear.
Yeah, thanks. It's just a wonderful way of looking at life. She is aware, she's clear, there is a directedness, and one can also see in the eyes, there is a shine. She is actively making potential. This is something you do. And that's a completely new experience, not something you had before. You are used to this. And what would it be the idea otherwise to linger on in the old ways? That is what we know, unsatisfactory. Otherwise, why would there be such constructions as, for instance, metaphysics of presence, or this idea that a model could replace real life and real experience, like in classical physics, or the Cartesian coordinates. This is also a typical picture where this is extremely painful. Here it's a blockage, and all the power, all the weight goes down to the cervical joint here, down here and down here. What we call in Swedish korsryggen, or the coccyx. And this is also the start of hernias and similar things. And we used to be this way when we were young, living in sort of a harmony. And one of the reasons for the child not being unbalanced, most of the time not being unbalanced, is the big head. See the size of the head. Because our head doesn't grow very much. And therefore it is way too heavy for the body to support if she's not balanced. But for us, our growing bodies have made the head proportionally smaller and smaller in comparison to the rest of the body. And for me as an adult, my head is size-wise only 1/8 of my whole body. And that means that I can actually displace my head without me falling together. And that's a good thing in one way. I don't fall together. But the bad thing is I can be standing up and still not being in any balance at all. So when we are very young, we can't lose our balance, because then we topple over. And I think that's interesting. Look at this little girl. She's perfectly balanced. And I think you can see obviously how big the head is in comparison to the rest of the body. What could it be? 1/5, 1/4. So what happens? The size of the head remains the same, whereas the body grows. And somewhere there, we manage actually to be out of balance all the time. And what we first destroy is our cognitive capacity. But that, as we mentioned before, is something that is already inherent in the young child. Already when it is this age, the seed is already there. The seed, the idea that the world has some sort of externality. But still, the disbalance cannot come into action, because then the child would topple over or fall over. Either like a forward complete fall. I've seen that a couple of times. But I would say backwards be the most easy things. So how does the collapse look like? Well, I stand like this, and the collapse is starting here with the tension, and then my head is turned down into the spine, and it goes this way. And at the same time, I am pulling forwards. My joints here in the knee become stiffened, and my ankles become stiffened. And the stiffness in the neck means that there is no cognition. There is no understanding of what other people say. And as we mentioned before, you can't understand what you're thinking yourself. And this is maybe one of the most interesting points coming from Shimiro. The most obvious things, you don't think the same thing over and over again. I suggested that before, but oddly enough, because there is no direction in your system, the occurring thought is slightly different every time. It doesn't mean the same thing. It is more that it doesn't mean a lot of things. It means very little. And when you become disbalanced, what you say and what you think lose in capacity to be directed. It is like your thinking doesn't mean so much for your system. So if you think up, you think positive, in the beginning it will have very slight effect. It will have some effect, which is very important. Remember that. But the effect will be slight. You are used to that your thinking are not very decisive. It's not a strong thinking. Actually, you assume every time you think it means the same. But look at it carefully. Obviously, it cannot be the same because your body changes during the day. Usually you collapse more and more the later in the day you are. You get more tired, you collapse more. Very big contrast here to the growing child who doesn't collapse. The growing child grows irritated, but it doesn't collapse. But we do. And in the collapse, our thinking goes down and our thoughts mean even less. And therefore, that effect comes on the whole system. Your voice will lose its sharpness. Your pitch won't be the same. And very interestingly enough, if you I checked out a little bit of this, the link you sent me earlier on. What was his name? Brewster, the phonologist that Kalle sent me earlier on. And he shows that when you're not in balance, your voice loses that interesting fractality. And that fractality is what I send to other people. And that is also what I send to a text, for instance. If I write something, the quality of that is losing, going down. And it's very interesting research how the lack of balance affects all parts of the system. There is no, some people think I have a free zone, maybe one part of the day or one part of my life, where I can actually do everything to the highest quality. That is not true. The disbalance affects everything you do. It affects what you say, affects your thinking, so your thoughts become what we usually call low chaotic. That means that they don't have much effect. And they don't gather to good solutions. You need to have like small strange attractors that are of a strong directed quality. All this goes down. When I read that, I was actually thinking of David Bradel, who shows that the cerebellum, what we call in Swedish, lillhjärnan, that was oddly enough mentioned yesterday. I think that was a bit fascinating. One of the participants in the small quantum conference we had yesterday, Stephen Mangold, he mentioned that he had actually done a dissection of a cerebellum once, and he was fascinated by the very strong structure, and it struck him, this must have a very big effect on the whole system. And it does. This is actually where the quality of the thoughts comes. And it's very closely connected to movement. We've known for quite some time that effective, coordinated and balanced movement, it's caused by a very well coordinated cerebellum. But now we also know that effective and coordinated thinking is also regulated, so to speak, by the cerebellum. And the cerebellum seems to be like the first instance where everything is constructed. And my proposition here is to think of the cerebellum In healthy activation, it's open, it gives very good pretension. You have this complex idea of what you're going to meet as sort of an image. Very clear image, almost of photo clarity, where all the senses are included. You have vision, you have tactile sense, you have smell, you have olfactory things, you have proprioception. If you make that clear image, it's very strong advantage, like a hermeneutical horizon meeting the exogenous. I would say that's a very strong standpoint from the cerebellum. And compare that to a weak stance. A weak stance is when you deactivate all the fantastic strength of the cerebellum. And that would be the ontic take, so to speak. You think the world is already somehow made up of different parts, like existence, and then you start non-existent. This is a simplification. It's still fractal, but it's of a very lower fractality. It's simplified. It is like a sketch. If you draw something, you just make, in this, if you come here, please. If you come here, you can see this is very complex. But if I just do lines like this, I can make a very short sketch, and that will be not enough to meet the exogenous. So this slump position is connected to a cerebellum that is deactivated, pacified by the idea that the complexity we send out is so simplified it won't give an interesting read-off or a complex read-off. It will not have depth, and it will not have this more of deeper, wider understanding. And this is usually the case, and that means our thinking, our thoughts are going to clump together, and we get this thinking that is very typical for the N2 neurons. And those are pretty sharp thoughts, but they're not connected to each other, because they are usually produced at one instant, at only one level. And the more complex thinking is more like a fern, if you remember that one. The fern is iterated on each level. So if you have like a leaf of the fern looking this size, and then you zoom in, and then you will find another leaf, and that leaf is an iteration of the big leaf. Going into the depth, going down, is going down in scale, but also acquiring the complexity of the big leaf, bringing in the small leaf, and then you bring in the even smaller leaf. And this can be seen here in the Mandelbrot set, that is a deepening. If you sort of zoom in here, you will get this, and then you will get this, and then you will get this. So on something that looks very simple, like the sketch idea, the ontic take, it would turn out to be more and more complex. In the previous lecture, I mentioned this with Maina. I said it came from Estonian. Kalle added a deeper complexity, that Finnish and Estonian is related, and there is a similar word, not meaning exactly the same, but similar. And you see, it deepens, and this is how knowledge works. And for every level, it adds, so to speak. It doesn't contradict each other. The new knowledge I gained from Kalle did not contradict the knowledge I had before, but it deepened it. So you see, as long as we don't allow for contradiction or put in contradiction, it can deepen. But as soon as I put my foot down and say, I'm going to put in a contradiction here, the depth stops here. Here is where the buck stops. You don't get any further with the contradiction. And the contradiction could be, if it's inferred by yourself, almost like telling the cerebellum, don't make any more interesting fractal complexities. Don't go any deeper into the subjects. You can also tell yourself, I already know everything. It's a little bit like that. You can either say, I don't know anything, or you can say, I know everything. They both get exactly the same effect on the cerebellum. There is no change whatsoever. Knowing everything means you give up the work. And since the cerebellum is active, it's an activity, it's a verb, like we used to have in the pre-Socratic thinking when it comes to the Odyssey and the Iliad. And that is sort of progressive directed thinking. I think we should try a little bit by this showing maybe with inspiration a bit from the book. Let's see here. I think there is an interesting chapter here with body image, and this is pre-Connable, before we understand body map, because this book is a bit older, but it still shows that the author, John Gray, he had some sort of concept that there were such a thing as a body image. And I have to say, this is really true. This is one of the reasons we use this Tadasana, for instance. If you think about a mountain and you actually make yourself, your imagery, the projection, the pretension, or whatever you like, you make that really tall, really wide, like a mountain, you will change both physically your body and your mind. Because mind and body needs to be changed simultaneously. There is no use just changing the body. It's completely useless. Because in the end, the mind always reflects the body. So although they are separate, using them both, directing them both, will do the trick. And then you can have both separated and also together. Whereas you confound them and you treat them as a division, a contradiction, you don't get the depth, because instead you stay on one level, because having a contradiction is one singular level. It's a little bit like monosemic take. If I say the meaning of book is book and the rest of the world would be non-book, we sort of stay on the same level. Everything can be divided into what is book and what is not book. And there is no deepening there. Whereas I instead look at depth, its specifications. Could be that the book has many pages and the book has many paragraphs and it has many words, it has many letters. You go down into the iterations like you have the fern, you zoom in, and in the end, what do you find? You find the difference between the black ink and the surrounding whiteness of the sheet of paper. And then you can go even deeper than that. Which is the correct level? Well, in a way, they're all correct. You can't say a certain level is less correct than another one. And here we don't have this exclusiveness. And when I say exclusiveness, we don't exclude the different levels. And all of a sudden, we have this deepening. And when we start with the deepening, we can also widen. Take in what's around the book. How do we take in what's around the book? Well, we don't make that sharp contradiction between what is non-book and what is book. We leave an openness. And this will happen at the same time as the deepening evolves. Because the deepening is the same as calming down the system a bit. It gets very busy here with the contradictions. It's a little bit, if you would to be waken up by an urgent phone call and somebody screams at you, something's happening, you need to get out now. Your neurons too will be activated. It would be fight or flight. And fight and flight is more or less putting everything in black and white perspective. And once you do that, there is a certain crowdedness, because there's only one level to sort of inhabit. And this level is constantly divided. You have very little space. For instance, you start with the division book and non-book. And if you're stressful, you already don't have any depth. You won't get any width. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to divide the area you already divided. And then you have to divide this area, and then you divide it once more. And what you get in the end is an extreme crowdedness. And this is what David Braddell calls this balloon mind, when there's too many thoughts going on. And what that means effectively, it's no directedness. And the sense that there are many thoughts going on is that you constantly make these stressful contradictions. I could compare this to, take the very same day somebody calls you up, you urgently have to do this and that. And then you understand after a couple of hours you need some food. And then you're already stressed when you go into the shop and you can't decide. This is typical of people who are suffering from burnout. They can never decide. What is the reason? The reason is you jump between alternatives and you put in a contradiction or a negation. And that won't work if you rush into, for instance, a candy store. You have to make divisions. Instead of seeing the different candies, you make divisions, not the red candy, and then you have like 50 different other ones that are not that red candy. That's not an effective way of making a decision. Better is to have the openness and see all the details, and then you can decide. It will lead to a decision in the end, this contradiction thing. But the contradiction or negation thing is much more connected to the N2 neurons. And of course, they're connected to this muscular thing called the T2. The ones who don't give you stamina. It would be very hard to stand on one leg, for instance. Well, I could do it now, but they don't give the posture muscle any chance. It doesn't give any strength to you, and you constantly collapse. And it is this collapse I want to take a look at. I'm going to ask my dear colleague soon here to collapse on this stool. And this is something we all do. It's nothing wrong with it, but what I invite you to do is rather to understand the process. There's no, don't put in prohibition here, it's wrong or something like that. The method of the physiotherapist, as we say in Swedish, sjukgymnast, is that oblige the patient. You cannot slouch. For instance, a friend of mine, he suffered from
hernia.
No, it wasn't hernia, it was ischias. I don't know what that's called in English. The ones of you who understand Latin, it's ischias in Latin, I think. And he was told by the physiotherapist not to slump anymore, because that makes the ischias worse. And now he's sitting like he has a rod in his column. Yes, the issue is better, but he's developed other symptoms. So there is no good telling the body to do things. Do things with the mind. And how do we do things with the mind? No, we try to understand, what is the slouch? What does it do to my thinking as well as to my body? And I think once you understand that the thinking you do in this position is not as good as the thinking you do in this position, then you will have the motivation to change your posture. Actually, I don't think you need a motivation, because you automatically will change. it is a little bit like you convince your brain that is working still. But if you notice, if you go down to this area, there is a certain tiredness coming into your mind as well, and all of a sudden your thoughts are not as clear, there is not the same directedness. And when you understand, you can actually gain this directness. Put a pause. So what I invite you to do is, I'll ask Kalle here just to silently read for himself, maybe a paragraph or something like that. And we are going to spy on him and see how he sits and everything. And I think it's very important here not to be like the physiotherapist who said to my friend he needs to straighten his back and so forth. Because what we're going to do instead is look what it does to the thinking. What does it do to the mind? And I think that is the way to find, I would say, not only motivation, but what I'm inviting you to do is to find a deeper understanding how these things are connected. And I would say only when the understanding comes, there could be a change. And that change comes from knowledge of how, in a way, body and mind are absolutely connected. Maybe it could also be that this representational thinking is a sort of evil helper. It's a little bit like the demon of Laplace. It makes us stick into this position and think that our thinking is always the same. So as long as we think about representation, that we don't get tired in the afternoon, that we are not clear in the morning, and we don't understand the directedness, the strength of thinking, what Bergson called elan vital, ki or prana, until we understand the connection between body and mind, and that we are immensely helped by directing our thinking, that our bodies are actually like mountains and they're well placed, and you do that imagery, that will strengthen it. I will now show another thing. You can continue to read, and I invite you to feel your sitting bones as a start. Yes, that was very good, Kalle. I think that actually showed on, we saw how Kalle almost collapsed or fell. It was a second of disbalance. And that's very good. Look at that, remember that. And now he's slowly finding his sitting bones. And what I want you to do is practice like 5-10 minutes and see if there is a change in the understanding of the text or your thinking. And I'm not sure if that is so easy in the beginning, but as time goes, you will notice there is a quality to thinking, and it's not always the same. So what representational thinking, you can continue to do whatever you want if you want to change place. What representational thinking is doing is obscuring all the differences that continually is going on with thinking, and well, here we have an excellent example. Here we have a little happy child, and no, come in. Here have a child who is balanced, coming in here, carrying his bag. Good afternoon, god eftermiddag. You want to say hello to the camera? Ska du säga hej till kameran?
Säg hej.
Tack så mycket, jättesnällt. Tackar. Spatsera omkring lite grann här.
Dominic, say hello, say hey.
Hello to the camera. He's a bit camera shy. But as we say in Swedish, like a mail on the post, we got a really good example. But I want to add another feature here, and this is something we discussed maybe once before. And that is that the body has actually features. We think the body having no characteristics whatsoever. Actually, there is a division in the body, and it's between dorsal and ventral. This part of the body is not very ticklish, whereas this is ticklish. Here is a dividing line going between the ticklish part and the not ticklish part. And it goes this way. And if you imagine there to be a difference, the ticklish part being white and the underneath ticklish part being black, and you constantly, so to speak, bye-bye, enhance the vision of this difference, you will strengthen the difference in the body, and that will make it more directed. The difference goes, so Kalle has this side is dark, this is the same, not very ticklish part. If we want to tickle somebody, we usually tickle this part. And this continuous goes up this way, round the ear, and going down to the nose, and that is part of the black part. This division is present in all, I would say, spiritual / mind traditions of the East. It is present in yoga, but it's also present in Qigong, Tai Chi, Karate, and those things. And this is an actual division in space, one we need to learn. And the more we sort of implement this idea of a division of a blackness and a whiteness, the stronger the directedness of the body will be. So it's very good to repeat that in mind. And what you will notice in the beginning is the first imagery you do will be very weak, but it will eventually strengthen and become stronger and stronger. This is a characteristics of mind. This is projection. So the projection is actually to see the body in two divisions, the black part and the white part. And you train that. And as you see the imagery is getting stronger and stronger, it will have more effect on the body. And then you will understand that you can actually use it for understanding a text, whatever the text is. Because this is usually called dorsal and ventral, but you can also call it yin and yang. And everything is sort of infused with these two different sources of reality. And it's in the difference between these two reality does its presence. It's oddly enough very close to the aletheia and theia of Heidegger. And as Heidegger says, it's in the crossing of theia and aletheia that reality, or presencing as he calls it, emerges. And I would compare presencing to this more healthy, stronger body, because it is constantly paired with a stronger mind. And I think you'll find much greater understanding looking into what the effects on the mind is. That you get more knowledge. And I give a thumbs down to the physiotherapists, because they are too focused in the body. And what you will do is that your thinking doesn't change, and if you exaggerately stretch yourself, like my friend had to do, like this way, that will put pressure here. It's very good here. You can see how the back of the lower back is turned in actually. And that could actually cause problems both in the back and I would say in the hip. This is very common today. People try to stretch without having this finesse, this more precision. And the precision is coming from the cerebellum. And do not forget forever that the cerebellum is also responsible for our movement, both in body and in thinking. The cerebellum doesn't do any difference. There is a difference in reality, but the cerebellum doesn't do any difference. So better thinking, it's an imagery where you see the divisions in the body and you clearly project them. And I'm absolutely convinced all animals already do this. They cannot sort of flaunt that. That's inherent in their system. But since we are more complicated as human beings, we manage to make a division between mind and body. We think. We cannot do it. What we can do is lose energy both in thinking and in body. And I think this little experiment here today shows that you can actually heal that. You can heal the imagined chiasm between body and mind. I say thank you very much from the gallery, and here we have my dear friend, the proprietor of the gallery.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon, and thank you, Kalle, for helping me with the demonstration. Bye bye for now. Cheers.